Hello. Today I will be featuring a German cruiser that has caused a lot of gray hairs for a lot of people, and that is of course the Nürnberg, the Tier 6 German cruiser. Now, there has been some recent buffs, of course. They have improved the HE, but more importantly for the Nürnberg particularly, well, let's start off by showing the matchmaking. Horrible matchmaking. The enemy only has one Tier 6, which is my tier, and that's the Leander, so he's going to be in a smoke, and probably I won't even be able to shoot him. All their battleships are Tier 8, every single one, and they have a Tier 8 carrier. Everything else is pretty much Tier 7 or Tier 8, so yeah, exactly one guy who's my tier, everyone else is higher tier. So this is nightmare status for the Nürnberg, and of course matchmaking like this is what has made, for many people playing the Nürnberg, very frustrating, because, well, the Nürnberg is extremely squishy. I don't think there's really a good way to describe the ship other than extremely squishy. First of all, the health pool is 27k, which is, I think, already the lowest of all Tier 6 cruisers. I don't know if there's anyone who actually has lower health. It's extremely squishy. I mean, Cleveland has 35k health, so that kind of puts it into perspective just how little 27k is. And to top it off, it only has 50mm of broadside armor. 50mm of broadside armor, and the Citadel is above the waterline and large and honestly very easy to hit. In fact, even DDs using AP can consistently Citadel the Nürnberg because the armor is so thin and the Citadel is so large. And this of course makes it, because of everyone knows this as well, so, well, you can see the detected sign. As soon as you get spotted, you're going to see a lot of people focusing you. It's kind of like sailing the Pensacola, except an even more extreme version, because everyone loves shooting the Nürnberg. It's whenever I shoot the Nürnberg and I don't get a Citadel, I tend to joke that my game is bugged, because you're pretty much all you get are Citadels. However, these new turret angles, as you can see, makes this ship a lot more comfortable to play, because you can angle better. You don't have to turn the turrets around if you switch angles. I mean, you're able to keep your broadside more protected thanks to this. Ultimately though, being able to keep your broadside more protected doesn't help that much, because, well, the ship simply can't tank. It's just too squishy, the armor is too papery, and ultimately the best way of playing this ship is to avoid getting hit in the first place. You want to use the range, borrow a smoke, as I'm doing here. In fact, all the way from the start I made sure to sail next to the Kutuzov, so that if and when he smokes up, I could leech his smoke. Especially when you're against tier 8 matchmaking like I am here, feel free to use every single trick you can think of. Now you're seeing a lot of shattered shells, and well, I'll get into that later. Well, that's of course because we're shooting a Bismarck. But moving on, the concealment is 10.8, which concealment expert and with the camo, and 10.8 is pretty good. I mean, it does beat some ships like, well, let's take the Cleveland. Everyone is familiar with the Cleveland. Cleveland has 11.4, so you beat it by 600 meters, but ultimately that additional concealment isn't enough of a buffer to compensate and make up for just how squishy this ship is. But it's worth mentioning that the concealment is at least good. The speed is 32 knots. Which is not particularly fast. In fact, most of the cruisers at this tier are slightly faster. Some are a lot faster, like the Budionni, which does like, what, 35 without flag. But it's not Graf Spee 28.5 not slow either, so it's pretty okay. Not fast, but not a complete slowpoke either. The bigger issue is the fact that it has a turning circle of 720 meters, which is, I think, the second worst at this tier for cruisers. The only one that has a worse turning circle is the Molotov's extremely anemic, I think, 860 meter turning circle, but other than that, pretty much every other cruiser beats this turning circle. And of course, when you have a large Citadel and very thin broadside armor, things like having large turning circles become a much bigger issue than it would normally be. So that's why I highlight that fact, because, well, these kind of problems tend to compound each other, and one of the reasons why the ship is quite tricky and challenging to play. The rudder shift is 6.1 seconds, which is pretty standard. That's pretty much Some have slightly better, some have slightly worse. It's around the normal one. The AA on the ship is absolutely abysmal. I mean, I'm running the B hull, but you can run the C hull for better anti-air. But the C hull, you have to trade off torpedo launchers on both sides, so I don't consider it worth it, because ultimately, regardless of which hull you run, your range is only 4.2 km on the anti-air. So you have to run the AA module just to reach 5 kilometers of range, and even then the long range AA is still terrible on both the B and the C hull. So I don't consider it worth it at all, and I just go with the B hull because then you have torpedoes on both sides. Speaking of torpedoes on both sides, this ship actually has a great torpedo armament. It has 2 X3 launchers on both sides, meaning a total of 6 launchers on both sides. And I mean, they have 6 kilometers of range, which is okay. They only deal 13.7 k per each torp, but considering you're actually able to launch a total of 12 of them, since 6 on each side, you can pretty much wreck anything if you get to YOLO it. So the Nürnberg is a huge YOLO threat in that sense, and if you have the opportunity to YOLO a battleship, you can absolutely wreck it with torpedoes, no doubt. Now, most of these stats probably don't sound that impressive. In fact, what I've been saying consistently is either it's got standard or worse stats than most of the cruisers, and that's kind of the theme for the Nürnberg. To compensate though, we have the guns. These are the bread and butter of the Nürnberg class, and the guns have always been great, but the HE buff that came with the German cruisers has made them significantly better. And because, well, when your bread and butter gets buffed, it of course makes them even stronger. Now, the guns have great range, 16.5 kilometers of range when upgraded, and a pretty damn great shell velocity of 960 meters per second. Actually, pretty amusingly now is that that still isn't the best cruiser range. In fact, Molotov has 16.6 kilometers of range on the guns and 950 meter shell velocity. So, well, let's not talk about that special Soviet balance cruiser right now. The German AP deals heavy damage, but the issue it has, especially on these lower tiers, I got plane spotted, so I needed to angle there, because as you can see, when I can't use smoke and I don't want to use juking around from long range, I use terrain. You notice how I'm parked right behind this island and just using my range to my advantage, and using the concealment, or well, the islands to my advantage to deal damage from cover. This is something you need to learn, not just as any cruiser, but especially as the Nürnberg. Anyway, the problem with the low tier German AP is that it doesn't have that much penetration. When you get higher tiers, it becomes more consistent, like Hindenburg, Rune, even Hipper, it starts to become this big threat. But on these lower tiers, it's mostly if someone gives you really close range broadside that it's actually useful, because these shells are so light and they lose so much velocity at long ranges that the AP doesn't really do much at long range. So you have always had to deal with HE at long ranges. Now, the issue with HE is of course that, well, 150mm HE tends to shatter a lot. That's why these 150mm guns on both the Nürnberg and the Königsberg were always prime candidates for running IFHE, and in fact I recommend IFHE on these kinds of calibers. However, with the buff, you no longer need to spec IFHE. IFHE comes built in, and this North Carolina, which is a tier 8 battleship, well, you see I'm getting a lot of penetrations. I'm not getting any shatters on him, I'm just getting a lot of penetration damage on him. And that is because of this new buff, which means that the shells are no longer shattering, but they are able to penetrate his armor and deal damage, which is a pretty huge thing. First of all, it saves you captain perks. Now you don't need to wait until you have a 10 or 14 point captain to be able to spec IFHE to get the most out of the Nürnberg. You can already do it straight from the box, which is fantastic. Second of all, you no longer have to give up the 3% fire chance. You get to maintain your 8% fire chance by default. In fact, if you spec IFHE, you went down to, I think, you went down to 5% fire chance. Yeah, you went down to 5% fire chance, which is horrible, of course. But now you spec DE and you skip IFHE and you're sitting at 10% fire chance, as I'm doing in this vid. So that of course means that you, with 10% fire chance, and considering your reload is 6 seconds and you're shooting 9 guns, suddenly you're not that bad of a fire starter. No, you're not going to be the best fire starter, you're not going to be a Cleveland, but you don't kind of need to be the best fire starter either, because, well, your HE is now significantly more consistent. The reason, of course, these calibers 150 to 155 millimeter is so popular for IFHE is because you bypass multiple armor thresholds, which prevent your shells from shattering. But with the buff, you no longer need the IFHE. It's built in. Now, this of course applies to all German cruisers, but the higher tiers don't really benefit that much, because first of all, IFHE was never recommended for 203mm guns like you have on the higher tier German cruisers, so it was kind of pointless. It does of course help. The new penetration does help. I've never argued that it doesn't help it, it's just that it wasn't worth specking for captain points and losing out on that HE chance just to get it. But getting it for free is of course a buff. But ultimately the ones that benefit the absolute most from this buff is this lower tier German cruisers like the Königsberg and the Nürnberg that both have 150mm guns. The HE is still weak though. I mean, the HE Alpha is 1.7k, and if we look at ships like, well, Bouillonni or even the French cruisers, they have 2.2k HE Alpha, and you have 1.7. But the difference is now that you are far more consistent. Because, well, they get that consistency if they spec IFHE, but you can reach the consistency without having to spec it. So you won't be dealing any massive HE volleys like you would in, for example, IGN cruiser, which has this huge HE alpha, but you will deal very consistent and steady damage. And combined with the 10% fire chance, you're also not a bad fire starter at all. Now, the game itself, I've actually managed to, well, you've seen me use terrain, you have seen me borrow smokes from my mates, and in general just dodging. Like, for example, this turret is shooting me now, so I make sure if you look at the bottom left or even the minimap, you can see just how sharply angled I am. One of the advantages of the Nürnberg is of course the fact that you have 2 guns in the stern, and well, that kind of tells you how you are supposed to be playing the ship. You want to kite, you want to dodge, you want to turn away from the shells and just be a nuisance, constantly shooting, and only when they turn away and they stop targeting you, that's when I start chasing them again and turn, well, broadside or more of my ship towards them. Every time you get shot at, you turn the stern and you make yourself a small target. In general, you also want to stay at pretty much max distance, as you can see I'm doing right now. Literally my shells can just barely reach him, making the most out of this great distance I have. Algerie is aiming at me, I think. There's one in front of me, but there's also Mayhem who's, I think, is aiming at me, so I pop my Hydro here. I am running the German Hydro, of course, and this is a good time to pop it, since I predict that I will soon be torped, since the Mayhem hasn't been seen in a while, and I've been sailing this way for a long while. I'm also between the Mayhem and the battleship, so I would be an optimal target. And speak of the devil, the Mayhem is trying to torp me, and my Hydra picks up the torps. So I turn left and avoid the torpedoes, while still constantly hammering these German turpits. I'm trying to get another fire started, which I do get, and that should finish him off. But actually a Bismarck finishes the kill instead, so I don't get it. That's okay though, because this game is very close. It's actually a 4 versus 4. I have managed to have a pretty big impact on the game so far though. 111,000 damage and 3 kills, which is nice. But the game is still far from won. In fact, our Shokako hasn't been launching any planes in a long time, which makes me think that he has been deplaned a good time ago. So that's of course an issue, whereas the Lexington still has planes. I still see bombers and torpedo bombers on the field. So that's a pretty big threat to me, not just because I'm running Hydro, but I am also running, as I said, I have terrible anti-air in this ship, so tier 8 planes could absolutely shred me. I do kill the Hipper though, and now I start working on the Algerie. The Algerie is sailing in a straight line, which makes it much well, he needs to angle against the 2 battleships, but he happens to be sailing in a fairly straight line for me, which makes it pretty easy for me to land the shells. I get a fire, he repairs it instantly, and well, if you're under HE spam and you're in the open, repairing a fire is a good way to get killed. So I start 2 fires on him, following it up, and well, at this point I don't need to shoot him anymore. There was some additional torps coming my way, and my Hydra I think picked them up just in time, or it could have been my fighter plane, and the 2 fires should finish off that guy, the Algerie, and I do actually get my Kraken. The enemy is starting to capture our base at this point though, but the Bismarck is the closest to our cap. You can see on the minimap the Bismarck is the closest to our cap, and the North Carolina, well, there's nothing the North Carolina can really shoot at. He can't shoot at the Lexington like I can. So optimally, of course, these 2 battleships should turn around and sail to our base and save our base. As I said, the ship isn't particularly fast. It only does 32 knots, whereas, well, NC does 27.5, and the Bismarck does 31 knots. So these 2 could easily be sailing towards a base already and trying to save it. But, of course, battleships don't really want it. The Bismarck is in fact spamming base with caps lock, but he's still not turning around for the base himself. He's still chasing the carrier, which, once again, neither of those 2 battleships can actually shoot this carrier. I'm the one who's actually spotting the carrier, and I'm also the one who's at the biggest risk of being killed by this carrier, which is why I can't leave him, because as I said, tier 6, he's tier 8. If I turn away and flee, this Lexington might just bomb me and kill me off, because I have no idea how many planes he has left. So I am probably the least likely person who should be going to our base. These 2 battleships should have been going for the base for a long time ago. The Bismarck keeps spamming base, but he's still not turning for the base. Now the NC chimes in and says, "Cruiser, go to our base." But he's still not turning around for our base. He is still doing some sort of adventure back there. Now he's saying that we are losing if you don't. And at this point I'm consistently wondering, why has neither of those 2 guys sailed to our base? Well, obviously they are battleships, so clearly they feel that it's not their responsibility. Interesting, of course, this is battleship logic, I don't understand it. However, I do kill off the Lexington, but he does launch a torpedo plane. However, because I killed him off, he can no longer make a manual drop, so I know that this will be a torpedo auto drop, which means I should be fairly safe. The North Carolina still hasn't sailed for our base. He's now sailing for the enemy base. I have no idea why, but I do manage to hit the Mayhem that was capping our base, because, well, the Shokaku played this very smart. Unlike the 2 battleships who, well, just stood there and complained how someone else needed to do the work, the Shokaku pushed into the cap and prevented the Mayhem from capping by just his presence alone. The auto drop comes in, but as I said, the Lexington is dead, so he can no longer drop me. I turn in and dodge the torps. And at this point, thanks to the Shokaku spotting, and well, the Mayhem is trying to shoot him and kill him, I should be able to finish him and kill him off. And I do kill off the Mayhem, and the game does end with a pretty spectacular score, considering I was tier 6 against tier 8. Only 2 planes shot down, no surprise there. As I said, Nürnberg and tier, not much to brag about. I think I would have made 700 credits, but I completed some mission we had going on EU, which gave me 1,000,000 credits. Not that I needed. 17.5k XP and 11k free XP. I'm of course running the flags from the recent Bismarck campaign, which multiplied the daily win. This was just my daily win in it, so that helps me a lot. Looking at team score, well, the base XP 2.6k, which normally I wouldn't consider that impressive, but considering the matchmaking I was against, this is actually a very satisfying score. Like, I was hugely matched up. No surprise, of course, the Bismarck and the North Carolina. Oh, it was actually a different Bismarck that was complaining at me to go. Once again, amusing that he was shouting at me and not the other Bismarck. Regardless though, my 2 tier 8 battleships end up at the bottom of the scoreboard. Not very surprising considering how they approach this game. Still though, 7 kills in a Nürnberg and against tier 8 is highlight worthy. Detailed report wise, not really that much spotting damage. Potential damage 700k. You can get a lot more. It kind of depends on what kind of map you have, if you're able to use cover or borrow smokes from buddies like I was, or if you're forced to kite a lot in the open and dodge a lot of shells. Looking at the damage, main battery is, well, HE 91k. Looking at fires, 55k. I almost got Witherer. Now, I actually didn't have that special of a fire chance. I only got 16 fires. 16 fires sounds like a lot, but then you gotta consider I landed 265 HE shells, so that actually only puts my fire chance at around 6%, so not really any sort of RNG god blessing. I didn't end up using much AP in this game because I really never had a good chance for it. If you get a lot of cruiser broadside or battleship broadsides, the AP is great, but this game, well, I thought it was fitting with the recent HE patch because this game shows off the HE a lot. Ultimately though, 158k damage, which is quite nice, and damage received almost none because I made sure to dodge and avoid as much of the damage as possible. Credit and XP wise, well, I actually made 48,000 credit, 48,000 captain XP this game. I was only running a 12-point captain because, well, I couldn't be bothering moving some of my 19-point captains, so I just took one old, I can't remember where I had this captain, but I just spec'd him for the Nürnberg. He had 12 points, and winning this game pretty much gave me an entire perk point. So this is of course with all the different camos and flags on top. That's it. That's why I made 48,000 captain XP. Anyway, that was my Nürnberg commentary. I'll move on to my recommended build, and well, most of the build you can get with a 10-point captain. In fact, everything I did here you could have done just as well with a 10-point captain. Most of the points are kind of wasted for now, but let's move on to the build itself. Right, starting off, we'll start with the modules as usual. Now, I highly recommend getting the range module first, because the default range of 15 kilometers is just so pitifully small. Now, ultimately you do want both the upgrades, but the difference between the A and the B hull is only 3.2k health and a bit of maneuverability. And ultimately, in this ship you don't want to get hit in the first place, and 3.2k is barely a battleship penetration. So it doesn't really make much of a difference, whereas the ability to sit at 16 kilometers instead of having to sit at around 14.5 makes it much more comfortable. Yes, I took about 500 meters of extra space because you're kind of going to need it, because if a ship turns away you don't want it to be able to leave your range instantly. So range upgrade followed by the B hull. As I said in the commentary, I don't run the C hull. I don't consider it worth it because, well, you have to give up half your torps, meaning you give up one 3x launcher on both sides, and the trade-off is anti-air, but it mostly buffs the mid-range, a slight buff to the mid-range, and a large buff to the short range. So this is pretty much useless, so I don't consider it worth the trade-off at all. Not to mention you can save XP and money by just going for the B hull. Consumable wise, premium repair, and then if you can afford it, premium hydro followed by premium catapult fighter. I prefer hydro on these lower tier ships because, well, you should be maneuverable enough to dodge any torp drops, and first of all, they're unlikely to drop you to begin with, and second of all, the hydro is so much stronger than the defensive AA because, as I mentioned, your AA is really pitiful. Upgrade wise, main armaments mode 1, and I go for the improved dispersion, which is something I don't usually do on cruisers. Most of the time I tend to go for AA guns mode, but as I said, the AA is already a joke, so I'd rather buff these long range guns and of course help the torpedoes a bit than even attempt to go for any sort of AA, since it's such a sad state of anti-air. Damage control, because I've not found myself losing engine or steering at all. It used to be a thing, but they've kind of buffed that away. And finally, rudder shift, which is something I recommend on all cruisers. Captain perks wise, well, when I made a commentary I only had a 12-point captain. I've now gained a 13-point. But ultimately, most of the benefits I have, well, you can kind of imagine that I was playing that with a 10-point captain because some of the perks I have are not that useful. First of all, you want to get priority target, and then you get adrenaline rush, and then you get demo expert, and you follow it up with concealment. This is a very basic cruiser build, and this serves the Nürnberg excellently. I happened to have a 12-point captain when I made the commentary though, so I just took turret traverse for the hell of it, but the turret traverse isn't really that needed because first of all the turret traverse on the ship is already so good, and second of all you now have the 360 degree turrets, so it's even less necessary. So ultimately this perk is kind of pointless. The point I got, I just threw it into preventive maintenance because that's a pretty useful thing in general, but once again, not really that necessary. In fact, ultimately, you would probably want to start building towards my Hindenburg build rather than go for any of these perks. But I just put it there for the hell of it. Honestly, in terms of effectiveness to achieve what I did, you just need a 10-point captain, which means priority, adrenaline, fire, and concealment. And after that, you can just start building towards. I mean, York would benefit from expert marksman, which is the next ship in the line, but none of the other German cruisers need it. And ultimately, though, you would obviously want to start building towards my Hindenburg captain, which looks like this, and that includes, of course, vigilance and superintendent, because higher tier I tend to run defensive AA and rely more on vigilance to keep me safe, since, well, generally I'm not too worried about torpedo boats in the Hindenburg. But this would be of course the final goal for me. But the Nürnberg does just fine. The only thing you want fast is concealment expert and the fire chance. Other than that, you don't really have any specific things that this ship needs. IFHE would have been great in the past, but since you already have it built in now, there's absolutely no point to waste perks on this, because you just lose 3% fire chance and increased penetration is kind of wasted. So ultimately this patch has been very kind to both the Nürnberg and the Königsberg, because, well, these are both 150mm ships, so they get a massive benefit from this additional penetration. Whereas the higher tier ships, well, when you get to the higher tier German cruisers, you kind of want to be shooting a lot more AP, because it's so much more consistent and it has more power to be useful. And I mean, sure, the HE pen helps the higher tier cruisers as well, it's always a help, but it's not really that big of a deal as it is for these two lower tier cruisers. So for these guys, it was a pretty goddamn good buff. Anyway, that was all for me. I hope you guys enjoyed it.